all of us are different sorts of people. We have different tastes. We have different habits. We have different values. Nonetheless, all of us have one thing in common, which is we grew up at some point. We went through fetal development. We went through child development. And what the next two lectures are about is, what does stress have to do with child development? Okay, you already know the punchline in your sleep. You're running for your life. You're a young individual running for your life. You're a kid. And your body has better things to do under those circumstances than deposit calcium in your long bones, grow later if there is a later. Short-term stress response, highly adaptive. Chronic stress response, you impair growth. That's the concept that we'll run through the next two lectures. Chronic stress, environmental stressors can disrupt the normal growth process. Now, the point of this lecture is one critical fact, which is environment doesn't begin at birth. Environment begins in fetal life. And thus, the consequences of stress can begin in fetal life also. Now, what's environment like for a fetus? What's stress like for a fetus? Well, what it's about is what mom is experiencing. Because you share something absolutely critical with your mother when you're a fetus. You share her circulatory system. And the hormones in her bloodstream will wind up to some extent in your own circulatory system. The amount of nutrients will become relevant in there. You have all sorts of ways in which maternal experience is translated into fetal experience. Even something as straightforward as extremely loud noises, fetuses can respond to. It turns out amniotic fluid is this great vibratory, resonating environment. What's going on in the outside world can affect a fetus. And what we have is the simple punchline here is, you don't want to be a stressed fetus. You don't want to have the same sort of stressors that follow the same logic built around grow tomorrow, grow tomorrow. Now, what this begins to bring in are two realms of consequences of fetal stress. The first is what you're like at birth. And in the simplest sort of level, more fetal stress equals a lower body weight at birth. What sort of individual you're like at birth. And the other, a much more subtle point, is fetal experience, fetal stress, influencing what sort of adult body you're going to have responding to adult environments. Now, the second subtle point, the notion of fetal experience translating into how your body works as an adult, brings in all sorts of new concepts, one of which can be summarized with terms that are absolutely metaphors. The fact that a fetus makes decisions about what sort of organism to grow into, that a fetus is programmed by experience, by environment. These are metaphorical terms. Things get set down. Things get regulated in a permanent sort of way during fetal life. What do I mean by this? Let me give a first example, and this is an absolutely extraordinary one. I mean, we are all used to this typical sequence of scientific knowledge. In this realm, you study something in laboratory animals, you see how it works, you understand its world, and then you see if it works in humans. This is a case where it started with humans. And this is a phenomenon known as the Dutch hunger winter. 1944, World War II, Holland is occupied by the Nazis, and for a number of reasons, the uprising of resistance among the Dutch against the Nazis, the decision was made to punish Holland and divert all of the food that winter to Germany. And suddenly, Holland, with its reasonably good westernized diet, plunged into famine. Over the course of that famine, something like 16,000 people starved to death. Absolute disaster. And something very interesting came out of it. Suppose you were a fetus, a second or third trimester fetus during the Dutch hunger winter. What's going on? You are experiencing that starvation insofar as there's less nutrients in mom's bloodstream. You are experiencing this environmental stressor. So it turns out that one of the things that a fetus decides, one of the things in which a fetus is programmed to respond to, one of the things going on there is the fetus, in effect, is deciding, well, how much food is there out there in that world I'm heading into soon? And be a fetus at that time during starvation, and what your body concludes is there's not a whole lot out there. And thus your body gets programmed to be thrifty. What do we mean by thrifty? Every bit of food that hits your bloodstream, quick, store it away. Translated into a few lectures ago, every bit of nutrients that hit your bloodstream secrete insulin like crazy. Every bit of salt that you have, kidneys really good at retaining it because who knows when the next salt is coming. Be really thrifty at storing stuff. So, Dutch hunger winter ends, and suddenly you're going back to a normal, healthy Dutch diet, and everything else being equal, 50 years later, you are now close to 20 times more likely to have metabolic syndrome. Because your body learned as a fetus to be really efficient, really thrifty, really good at storing away nutrients, and you've programmed your metabolic system to work that way forever after. Mind you, if you were a newborn during the Dutch hunger winter, if you were first trimester fetus, it didn't work that way. You don't see this Dutch hunger phenomenon. It happens second and third trimester is when a fetus is programming its response to nutrients, how tripwire of insulin secretion it has. It's during that time that you are programming your adult metabolism. So there we see a really disturbing, remarkable phenomenon. And this turns out to be one of a number of examples of this, number of examples that have been summed by epidemiologist named David Barker as fetal origins of adult disease, FOAD, this completely new area of research built around the notion that environment doesn't begin at birth, and an awful lot of what's going on in fetal life causes programming of how adult responses are going to be remarkable. And soon people were studying this in laboratory animals, seeing experimental versions of prenatal stress, and you see the exact same thing. You can generate a Dutch hunger winter phenomenon. You can show that prenatal stress, and as an adult, you have a less than optimal stress response. You have elevated levels of glucocorticoids basally when there's no stressor. In the absence of stress, prenatally stressed rats, as adults, secrete more glucocorticoids than they're supposed to. Bad news. Prenatally stressed rats, as adults, take a longer time to recover after the end of a stressor for their glucocorticoid levels to go back to normal. Prenatally stressed rats, as adults, are more vulnerable to metabolic syndrome, all sorts of things, even the domain of behavior, anxiety. There's this chemical your brain makes, which is called an endogenous benzodiazepine. Don't panic. The synthetic, the drug version of it is something like Valium or Librium, anti-anxiety drugs. And just like all the other examples we've heard, the benzodiazepines that your brain makes interact with benzodiazepine receptors to decrease anxiety. A prenatally stressed rat as an adult has fewer of those benzodiazepine receptors in its brain, more of a predisposition then towards anxiety. Even in the realm of learning, prenatal stress and something about those elevated glucocorticoid levels disrupt aspects of brain development, aspects relevant to learning and memory. Prenatally stressed rats, everything else being equal from birth on, have more memory problems, aren't quite as good at learning, at consolidating new things, in part because they have elevated glucocorticoid levels as an adult, beginning to disrupt cognition. Stay tuned, that's going to be an entire lecture, but also because of that prenatal environment disrupting brain development. So look at this. We've got this whole world of prenatal stress, which could influence your levels of stress hormones as an adult, how readily you recover from a stress response, your brain chemistry that deals with anxiety, learning, vulnerability to metabolic disease. Again, that critical punchline, which is environment doesn't begin at birth. So there's an even more interesting ripple to this. And what it winds up doing is having Dutch hunger winter effects that are, in fact, multi-generational. Here's what I mean. You were a Dutch hunger fetus, Dutch hunger winter fetus, and 30 years later, you are now pregnant. You are having a child. Thanks to that fetal experience, you have a thrifty metabolism. You secrete insulin like crazy, so you're really good at stealing nutrients from your circulation. You retain salt, all that sort of stuff. So you are having a perfectly typical diet during your pregnancy, but as I just said, you are stealing an atypically large amount of it from your fetus. You are more efficient at taking nutrients out of the bloodstream, so for that perfectly normal diet, your fetus is getting less nutrients than it should. Certainly not starving, but insofar as you're absorbing more of it than normal, your fetus is getting less of it than normal. In other words, Dutch hunger winter babies, when they become pregnant, generate Dutch hunger winter babies. It's multi-generational. This has now been shown in the Dutch hunger winter humans. Their grandkids show some of these same tendencies. It's been shown in laboratory rats as well. This is multi-generational. Mind you, it's not as big of a phenomenon. It's one where it's a ripple of prenatal effect that with each generation gets smaller and smaller, but nonetheless, this is remarkable. Fetal life can leave an imprint, can leave an echo, can leave scar tissue of disease risk multi-generationally. Now, this is real critical in lots of ways because you look at this and you say, wow, this could easily be mistaken for something else. In other words, you take a rat who has been made a Dutch hunger winter rat as a result of fetal malnutrition, and as an adult is much better at storing calories, and as an adult, when she's pregnant, gives birth to babies who are a little bit prone towards this Dutch hunger winter phenomenon. You do a laboratory experiment, which is as soon as the babies are born, you take them away from the mom, and they're raised by a different mother. It's called cross-fostering, a standard technique in these experimental studies, and you see a trait in these babies that were fostered elsewhere, a trait that they don't share with their adoptive mother, a trait that they share with their biological mother, as seen here, this propensity towards metabolic syndrome. And you look at that and you say, well, all they had in common was their shared genes, took them away right at birth. Oh, if they have this same tendency towards this metabolic disease as their biological mom, it must be genetic. Look, it's passed on over time. And what we see here is, again, that truism, which is environment doesn't begin at birth. If you're not careful, some of these prenatal programming effects might be mistaken for, in fact, being genetic. Okay, so now we take this and we transition to the next logical phase, which is moving from all this prenatal stress stuff into postnatal, the sort of stress you experience during childhood. And how does that work? What are the general consequences? You know already exactly what it's going to be. It's the same punchline. In a child, as opposed to a fetus, chronic activation of the stress response does all sorts of bad stuff. And it's in a very similar realm, very similar sorts of punchlines. If you stress an infant rat, stress not by nutrient deprivation, so in this case, you're not producing a Dutch hunger winter effect, stress in all sorts of different possible ways, and you produce an adult rat with higher glucocorticoid levels. An adult rat who has trouble turning off glucocorticoid secretion at the end of stress, a rat with a somewhat activated stress response all the time when there's nothing stressful going on, a rat more vulnerable to a bunch of those diseases. You get a rat who is not as good at learning and memory, whose brain in the cognitive realm hasn't developed all that well. You get a rat that is more prone towards anxiety. You get a rat that has fewer of those benzodiazepine receptors in there. You have parts of the brain like the hippocampus, which does not develop as normally. Stay tuned. We'll hear plenty about that. You've got all sorts of these long-term consequences. The same sort of picture there. Now, what this begins to bring in is something even more subtle. first question that one might arise when grasping all these prenatal and postnatal stress effects is, well, how much do I have to worry about it in terms of, is this a Dutch hunger winter phenomenon? Everybody who has a fairly normal diet as a fetus, everything is fine, and it's only at the extreme that suddenly you get this increased metabolic risk. No, what you see instead is across the whole normal range of prenatal nutrition, across the whole range as manifested in birth weight as a percentage of body length, this is not just about the extremes. So once you recognize that it's not just about these extreme states, but instead the whole array of developmental stressors, moderate, medium, severe, all of that, the whole array of prenatal effects, suddenly you realize there's something that's got to come into the equation, which is mothering style. Different styles of mothering can represent and generate a more stimulatory environment, a less, a more stressful, all of that. And suddenly you've got this whole issue of, does mothering style have an influence on the nature of metabolic programming, what sort of stress response the offspring has an adult? And there's been some wonderful work done on this by lots of investigators. One of the leading ones, named Michael Meany at McGill University, fabulous scientist, and also an old friend and collaborator, who gave a very modern spin to a time-worn phenomenon in this field. Take a newborn rat, and over the first couple of weeks of its life, pick it up every day and handle it. Pet it for a few minutes. Take it away from its mom for a few minutes and then put it back. Do that every day for 3 minutes or so, and what you have now done is neonatally handled that rat. And what this counts as is stimulation. And remarkably, this is now a rat who, as an adult, will have lower glucocorticoid levels, that will have better learning and memory, as it turns out, will have a more neurologically intact old age, the right amount of stimulation. Meanwhile, do something else, pick up a rat and pet it and put it away from mom for 180 minutes, for 3 hours rather than 3 minutes, and then bring it back to mom, and you now produce an adult with a hyperactive stress response, an impaired cognition, and what you see is it's the exact same stimulus, maternal deprivation and tactile stimulation. 3 minutes, great thing. 3 hours, terrible thing. What we will come to in later lectures, where's the transition from stimulation to stress? So this very well-established phenomenon, this neonatal handling business. Now, when you stop and think about it, whatever's going on inside these baby rats did not evolve in order to give grad students doctorates out of petting rats 3 minutes a day. What's the equivalent in a rat's real world? And what Meany first showed was this translate into mothering style. You take the baby rats away from mom for a certain length of time, and you bring the rat back, and mom changes her behavior. And what you see is, when the baby's away for only 3 minutes, mom becomes more attentive. She grooms the baby more. She licks the baby more. Take the infant away for 3 hours, put him back with mom, and there's a certain degree of detachment that goes on then. Mothering style, what this handling phenomenon is mostly about, is what sort of maternal behaviors are elicited when you return the pup. Meany then took it one step further. Forget this, taking the pup out of the cage and petting it and taking it away from mom for differing lengths of time. Now just do something much more straightforward, which is look at the style of mothering. What's the normative range of mothering among rats? Remarkably enough, some rats are more attentive moms than other rats. The normal range of variability applies to all sorts of other species. Absolutely straightforward. Some rats lick their pups more than other rats do. Some rats groom their babies more, some groom them less, some are more or less physically rough with them, more interactive, all those sorts of things you can imagine. And what they see in their studies is the extent to which There's maternal licking and grooming will cause programming in adulthood. Get a mom who does an optimal amount of licking and grooming of her baby rat there, and she produces an adult with lower glucocorticoid levels, better learning and memory, all that sort of stuff. So that's absolutely remarkable. And it turns out that there's all sorts of ways in which rat mothering style translates into a different adult stress response in the offspring. Turns out to work the same way in non-human primates. And that can take all sorts of forms. Very simple sort of one. How anxious of a monkey mother do you have? What does anxiety in a mothering style look like in a non-human primate? Baby gets up and goes walking to start exploring the world. How far away from mom can it go before mom reaches over and grabs her kid and yanks them back, saying, the world's not a safe place when you get this far from me. And anxious monkey mothers, the kids go a tiny difference before mom communicates anxiety and, ooh, it's scary, come on back. And less anxious mothers even further away. And that translates into different stress hormone levels. That translates into different adult profiles of stress responses. Absolutely amazing. So we've now seen a couple of remarkable things here. One, environment doesn't begin at birth. These really long-term, persistent effects on physiology, on disease risk as a function of fetal stress experience. And we've now seen very similar sorts of themes in postnatal experience while growing up. And what we see is this is not just about extremes. This covers the range of differences in stimulation and stress that's encompassed even in differences in mothering style among rats and monkeys. Now, what's become a huge question in the field, a huge challenge, and one which has to be in there the second you start thinking about stuff working this way, is how does it work this way? How do you translate how much a mother rat licks her pups into what sort of glucocorticoid levels those pups are going to have in their old age in some cases? How does that work? And that is an extraordinarily tough problem to try to make any headway with, because this is not obvious. How does licking turn into a different hypothalamus or perhaps pituitary or adrenals? How did this stuff work? And this is where Meany and his collaborators have come up with some extraordinary findings. This whole new area of molecular biology, close your ears if this is more detail than you want, but this whole new field called epigenetics. You got genes which direct the construction of certain proteins, and when a gene activates, it generates a certain protein that it codes for. That's great. Genes as determining the workings of the entire universe. When does a gene know when to activate? And it turns out in your DNA, not only are there lots of genes, but there's on and off switches. Things in the outside world that will activate a particular gene to produce its protein product, all that sort of thing. And it turns out epigenetics, what epigenetics is about is early experience can cause a permanent stage of a switch being held on all the time or being held off all the time. And what Meany pioneered in showing is that mothering style causes certain epigenetic changes in the brain having to do with what sort of glucocorticoid levels there'll be in adulthood. It's still not clear how you get from licking to this epigenetic stuff. The nuts and bolts are getting worked out these days. How you do that, but at least it's understood now how differences in prenatal, postnatal experience produce propensities towards certain genes being more active than others or less active. Remarkable finding in the last few years. Go to those Dutch hunger winter adults, the human ones, and look at certain key genes in them, and there have been those epigenetic changes. What sorts of genes, not genes coding for eye color or how wide their feet are, or anything, genes having to do with insulin actions. Perfect, exactly what you would expect. So what we see here is the way in which experience, prenatal and postnatal, can shape the sort of hormonal profile you have as an adult, the sort of brain you have Early experience taking the form of severe stress, but also mild stress, and degrees of stimulation and mothering style, producing different profiles in adulthood, producing, as we saw most remarkably, even profiles in the next generation and the next. Okay, it's right around this point where if you were a parent, you grind to a screeching neurotic halt because, like, here's a whole new realm in which you can screw up your kids. Okay, I have to do something confessional here, which is tell you a few of the ways in which my wife and I have been horrible, horrible parents. There was the time when my wife was pregnant with our first child, our son, during the third trimester, where we went to what turned out to be a really loud concert, and right in the middle of it, our son kicked. And we said, oh my God, we're stressing him, this auditory environmental stressor, we have screwed up. Then there was the time that we meant to put on some video, one of those great educational ones, you know, like a video for 4-year-olds about plate tectonics or something, and we messed up with the machine, and for about 15 seconds instead there was some horrible, violent cartoon, and we messed up. Then there was the time, in order to placate my second child, our dog, we actually let her have some sugary cereal. Oh, we have messed up forever. We all know that neurosis, the notion that do something wrong with your child and there will be long-term consequences. Oh my God, that's crazy. You've got to get this stuff under control. And then along comes this whole field saying experience, remarkably subtle differences in experience, beginning as a fetus, produce the sort of adult you will be. Produce perhaps even the sort of children you'll have, these long-term effects, these fetal origins of adult disease. So suddenly you get that much crazier as a neurotic parent. Look at the ways in which early experience has long-term consequences. Okay, so in response to all this neurosis, there's some bad news and some good news. Some of the bad news you've already heard, which is this a world only of extreme adverse experience versus everything else you get a pretty normal outcome? No, we just saw that this covers the whole normal range of variability, amount of prenatal nutrition mapping onto adult metabolic profiles. So this is not just about them and their horrific parenting and prenatal lives. This is something that appears to apply across the whole range of development. Next source of bad news, which is how big are these effects? You know, if you're sort of a mainstream medicine type and you hear about stuff like this, the first response is that's ridiculous. There's no way stuff can work like this. And then when it is shown, yes, there are prenatal programming effects. The next sort of thing you do to kind of deny the importance is say, yes, okay, I give up, it's for real, but these are not big effects. These can be enormous effects. The Dutch hunger winter phenomenon, as I mentioned, be a prenatally stressed Dutch fetus during that Dutch hunger winter, and your increased risk of metabolic syndrome, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, your increased risk 50 years later is not a tiny effect, it's almost a 20-fold increase. So we got bad news. Normative range of developmental experience produces a normal range of better or worse adult profiles, and these are big effects. These are not little hiccups of biology. But now the good news. How inevitable is this to occur if you were stressed prenatally for 3.5 minutes, you're going to pay a price? No, there's enormous amounts of variability from one individual to another. Developmental stress does not guarantee that you are up the creek in that way. And the other piece of good news is, are these things permanent? Prenatal stress, and suddenly are you guaranteed to have a miserable hyperglycemic 80th birthday? No. What's also clear is, amid the persistence of these effects, there's a tremendous capacity to reverse them throughout life. Okay, so we got some pluses and minuses. Now, as you think about this, what's the undercurrent of all this parental anxiety of, did I do too much of this and too little of that, and all of this nutsiness? What's intrinsic in all of that after a while is, what's the optimal parenting style? And this is a domain of complete craziness. And you get some interesting insights into it when you look at work of, say, anthropologists who look at mothering styles as they vary cross-culturally. And there's different